Good evening and welcome to New Money. I'm Bryan. Tonight we're discussing how to prepare for your provisional tax payments, what you need to know, and how to avoid any pitfalls. August and February always seems to come around quickly. As the saying goes, the only two certainties in life are death and taxes. With STAR setting deadlines for different categories of taxpayers, the tax season officially opened for most individuals on 7th of July. This month marks the first provisional tax period. According to SARS, most taxpayers will be auto-assessed this year. And joining me this evening to make some sense of this is Werner Voss, tax practitioner from Davy Voss Tax Practitioner. Werner, thank you very much for joining me. Okay, Werner, starting point is, not everyone understands who must render a tax return. And when do you have to render a tax return?
Well, if you've got a tax number, Brian, you have to render a return. There are obviously cases where, under the new auto-assessment system, you are not required to submit tax returns. But that aside, people that need to file tax returns that may not be aware of their responsibilities would be people that's conducting an independent trade, people that are on receipt of allowances, people with foreign currency in excess of 250,000 Rand, and capital gains in excess of 40,000 Rand during a tax year will make you a taxpayer for that year.
So, Werner, you mentioned the word auto-assessment. So to just explain so that's automatically assessed, because I've already heard of people getting refunds, but I don't really put it, because you made the comment, if you auto-assessed, how do they know whether you've got any additional income? And one or two important components, how do you go about deducting medical expenses and retirement fund contributions?
Well, Brian, dealing with auto-assessments, SARS currently receives what we call information from third parties, financial institutions like banks, insurers, medical aids, and this information feeds into the e-filing system. And in many taxpayers' cases, they only have a single employer, one source of income, and usually a medical aid or a retirement annuity or maybe a bit of interest. And there's no need for them to claim expenditure. Those taxpayers' returns are then automatically generated by the SARS system and an assessment is issued. And if you do not want to claim, for example, medical credits or expenses against a motor vehicle or donations, the assessment would normally be correct and you can accept it. However, if you do not accept it, then because you want to claim those expenses, then you must request SARS to correct the assessment.
Geez, what a system, Werner. I mean, I know the system had a very sophisticated name some years ago. It was called the New Income Tax System, NETS. Is it so sophisticated?
Unbelievable. The system administrator and especially the e-filing interface, because remember, the e-filing system is not the SARS system. It's an interface between the SARS system administrator, as we call it, and the taxpayer. So yes, you're absolutely right. This is a very advanced system, probably one of the most advanced systems in the world. And it pulls information or draws information from all these financial institutions and then transfers the information to the tax number of the taxpayer. Because remember, every financial institution will have an ID number, and that ID number will hook up with the SARS system. And every ID number in South Africa, if you're a taxpayer, will have an ID number.
Werner, in previous years, and you as my tax practitioner, you've often said, even though I get my medical aid report, sometimes SARS wants to know more information about that medical report. Have they now done away with that?
Not at all. Remember, what information SARS would receive from, for example, the medical aids is the contributions you made during the year, the claims that you've submitted with the medical aid, and the claims that were reimbursed and the claims that were not reimbursed. So if that is all in the medical aid system, then it will go through to SARS. But for example, if you incur expenditure out of your pocket and you don't inform the medical aid thereof, SARS won't be aware of this, and this you will have to submit as a separate claim in your tax return at the end of the year when you file your return.
Okay, so I now get auto-assessed and I want to query a few things. Do I now need a tax practitioner, or do I go directly to SARS?
Well, the option is to go to a branch. If you're unsure or uncertain yourself, then I would suggest your first port of call must be the receiver of revenue. It's difficult to say whether at what point in time you'll need a tax practitioner. But I suppose if you start talking about multiple sources of income, maybe disability claims, when you start moving into that environment, I think you need to obtain the assistance of a tax practitioner.
Yeah. So Werner, can we rely on the fact that I've made a contribution to retirement fund, my medical aid, or do I automatically have to investigate further, or would you be comfortable for me to answer that viewers can rely on the information given to them?
I would say, to be prudent, you must always compare your certificates, because remember, these financial institutions issue these certificates, and I would always suggest that you compare those certificates to the information contained in the in the tax return. However, if you're asking me about accuracy and reliability, I have come across very few cases where the information has not been accurate or reliable. In fact, I would like to say that's probably an exception to the rule.
So Werner, will taxpayers get a report saying this is what you earned, these are all the other things, so they can check it? So this not.
Well, sorry, Bryan, it's not a report. Remember, you go into e-filing, you open your tax return. In your tax return, there's an opportunity or a button to refresh the data. Once you've clicked on that button, information then will be pre-populated to the tax return, and it's your responsibility as a taxpayer to compare that pre-populated data to the certificates in your possession.
Okay, so then let's move to the next category, which relates to provisional taxpayers. Let's understand what and who are treated as provisional taxpayers.
Well, in a nutshell, companies would be provisional taxpayers. But if you're a natural person, you will only become a provisional taxpayer if you earn what we call non-remuneration income. In other words, income not from an employer. In those cases, you need to register for provisional tax, because remember, Bryan, income that is not taxed at source, SARS will have no idea what you receive, when you receive, and what the tax on those amounts would be, unless and if only the taxpayer informs SARS of those untaxed amounts to be included in their returns and to be taxed thereon.
So Werner, this is a difficult time for you as tax practitioners, because you're sending out forms about what taxes you've got to pay. What is the responsibility of a taxpayer in the first 6 months of this tax year? In other words, from March to August, where they may have achieved capital gains tax. Can they carry that forward through to February and then do all the calculations, or do they have to make a provision now? And if they don't, are there penalties?
Okay, on that point, if you've had capital gains, and we're talking now about tax years March to February. So your first 6 months would be, as you've pointed out earlier, August, and the second period would be February, the last month of the year. So August is half year. And the view is, and the SARS position is, and that's what the law says, if you have received any capital gains in the first 6 months of the year, that has to be included in your calculation. But keep in mind, how the system works is you always annualize your income. So you'll take your income multiplied by 2. Your capital gain, if there was only one capital gain, for example, in the period up to March, will then be added to that figure and tax is calculated.
Sorry, Werner, up to August. You mean up to August?
No, listen to what I'm saying. It's there will be an annual estimate. In other words, you take your first 6 months, you multiply it effectively by 2 to get to a full year tax liability, which will then include the capital gain if there was only a once-off event in the first 6 months of the year. Tax will then be calculated on that amount, which will now include the capital gain. But then the tax liability gets divided by 2. In other words, you only provide for half year in August and full year in February. So provisional tax is not a separate tax. It's actually a mechanism to collect income tax, or it's like an advanced payment of income tax.
So Werner, what happens if you've got a managed portfolio and you don't have that information now because the companies actually do a yearly calculation and you aren't aware that maybe you've had capital gains? Because are there penalties if you don't pay it now and you only pay it in the second section of the year at February next year?
Yeah, sorry. Yes, as far as this first 6 months is concerned, you're absolutely right. You won't have financial information to compile this calculation from. So there's a principle, what they call a basic amount. A basic amount is essentially your taxable income of your year last assessed. They use that as a departing point from where your tax calculation or tax payment will then be increased or decreased. On that point, as far as the penalties are concerned, is that your half-year estimate does not make provision for an underestimation penalty, whereas the full-year estimate, that's in February next year, does make provision for an underestimation penalty. Because remember, in that month, it's the last month of the tax year. You know what your income was during the year. You know what your expenses and capital gains were during the year. And for that reason, you can do an extremely accurate calculation in February.
Werner, I want to before we get to our emails, I'm going to take a break, and then I just want to deal with 1 or 2 more issues asking you, and then we'll take emails. To our viewers, stay tuned. We'll be right back.